Let's start with that extraordinary phrase, martial law in Russia. Who would have thought that we're talking quite seriously about this prospect? What we do know tomorrow is that the Parliament will convene a special session where we believe they are going to make it a criminal offence punishable of up to 15 years for, their words, unofficially reporting the war. That means calling the war, well, a war, or calling the invasion an invasion, as opposed to the special military operation, which the Kremlin would much prefer. That we're pretty sure is going to happen, but it's not enough. There's a widespread belief amongst people that they could go for some form of martial law. A lot of young men getting out. We know somebody here we met this morning. He's getting out as soon as he can to Yerevan across the border, but he's taking out his mother as well. Young men because they're worried about being conscripted into the army, older people because they're just worried about the ongoing economic assault on this country. Another whole range of household global names and brands deciding today the time has certainly come to turn the lights off, lock the door and leave Russia. And of course there's no saying when any of them are going to be back. That obviously has an enormous effect on the public mood across this vast country. All at the same time, Vladimir Putin himself gave his update on the war and said the military plan is going along exactly as it was planned.
From his country residence tonight, a moment of theatre. Vladimir Putin pauses in remembrance of Russia's ever-growing casualty list, his invasion, his list. And again, yet again, it's all about fighting the Nazi threat. He used that word.
Никогда не откажусь от своего убеждения, что русские и украинцы – это один народ. Даже несмотря на то, что часть жителей Украины запугали, многие оболванены нацистской националистической пропагандой.
Children aged 7, 9 and 11. Their mums took them to lay flowers at the Ukrainian embassy in Moscow with placards saying no to war. They were going to send a video to a friend in Ukraine. All arrested. The children separated from their mothers. In St. Petersburg and scores of Russian cities, more protests. More than 6,000 arrested now, though the protests are in the hundreds, not the hundreds of thousands. Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader imprisoned for opposing, calls for protests every weekday in Russia at 7 p.m, weekends 2 p.m. Truth is not a concept here, it's a commodity. Manufactured, controlled, distributed from the Kremlin via state TV. There is no war. There is no invasion. Say otherwise and you can get 5 years inside. Call a spade or an invasion, and they will come for you in Russia today. Echo Moscow Radio and TV Dost, two of the last surviving independent voices shut down by the state for, quote, premeditated false information, talking about an invasion and a war.
Здесь не было никакого письма, то есть случилась блокировка, а потом уже мы получили это письмо. И как бы так как там размыты были требования, то не понятно, что удалять. Ну, то есть надо просто закрыть сайт и все.
Journalists from both now fleeing the country for their own safety.
Наташ, все хорошо, Наташ, слышите?
So how many Russians see images like this then? Their soldiers, now prisoners of war in Ukraine, given food and a call home to their mothers in tears. We can't verify these images, but they do appear to be genuine. Moscow's superficial normality belies the global freeze. Panic buying at IKEA as the furniture giant says it too is joining the rush to get out of Russia, closing all 17 of its stores here. DHL, almost all major car companies, Nokia, Harley-Davidson, Adidas, Disney, H&M, Puma, Nike, Apple, Boeing, all of them joining world sport in severing Russia from the rest of humanity.
Дорогой фондовый рынок, ты был нам близок, был интересен. Покойся с миром, дорогой товарищ.
Gallows humour as a financial analyst toasts the Moscow Stock Exchange, now shut for a fourth consecutive day. Another Russian's response on social media to Apple's pullout. And who needs the likes of Western iPhones, says Maria Butina, MP and former spy.
Ну что, родные мои, нам в очередной раз бросили вызов. Компания Apple приостанавливает продажи своих смартфонов в России. Но это на самом деле совершенно не беда. В моих руках вот такой вот замечательный телефон, отечественный телефон Aya T1.
Нашими лучшими в мире ракетами.
Russia responding in other ways. Its space agency telling the Americans today they can fly their astronauts on broomsticks after Moscow banned engine parts in retaliation. A little nearer ground level, broomsticks or Airbuses, companies like Aeroflot grounded from large parts of the world now, as Russia's economy is shut down day by day, hour by hour.
Alex Thompson in Moscow for us tonight. Well, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Western leaders are preparing for war against Russia and that Moscow would press on with military action in Ukraine until the end, whatever the end is. Well, Channel 4 News was the only British broadcaster to be given access to the video-linked press conference with Mr. Lavrov this morning. Kathy Newman quizzed him on civilian casualties, the death of 10-year-old Polina Zapadinskaya, who was shot by Russian troops near Kyiv as she attempted to flee Ukraine with her family, and the launch of the war crimes investigation by the International Criminal Court.
Mr. Lavrov, I want to ask you about Polina Zapadinskaya. She was in her final year of primary school. She was shot dead by the Russians as she was in her family car in Kyiv on Saturday. Mr. Lavrov, I know you have a daughter yourself. I want you to look me in the eye and just tell me, how do you sleep at night knowing that Russian bombs and bullets are killing children?
Могу сказать дополнительно к тому, что я уже сказал.
So what can I say in addition to what I've said already? Any human life is priceless. Any military actions are unfortunately connected to human loss, not just amongst the military personnel, but amongst the civilians. Our military personnel who are now involved in this special operation have a very strict order to only use high-precision military equipment to suppress the military infrastructure. Even the barracks where the Ukrainian army resides are not subject to any attacks. I can only express my condolences.
But you say Mr. Lavrov, you say high precision is used, but hundreds of civilians have reportedly already died. This is now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you personally are preparing your defense in a war crimes tribunal.
Понимаю ваше желание такие вот острые вопросы задавать. У вас будет аудитория.
I understand your desire to ask such heated questions as you want to emotionally charge your audience. This is your job, as far as I understand, to function as mass media, but rather as an instrument for hammering into people's head the information that is required by the Western leaders. I want to say once again, I am not justifying any action that leads to the death of civilians. But we were not the ones who came up with the expression of collateral damage. It was coined by our Western colleagues during their escapades in Iraq and previously in other countries, Latin America, Libya. Have you once used the same emotional charge covering the events in Iraq and Libya when there were hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties? I can't recall. So I see that your question is a rhetorical one.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Lavrov, I have. But this is, you started this war. Polina's blood is on your hands, isn't it, Mr. Lavrov?
Понимаете, играть вот в эти игры, вы сейчас...
You are now playing a game and acting like a talk show host. If you want to know my personal opinion, I believe I have already expressed it very clearly, including the humanitarian aspects of the current operation. But I would really like you to, though I understand you will be covering it the way you're required to, but I really want you to bear in mind, and I hope that a journalist who is fulfilling a brief has a conscience, how you have conducted yourselves for the last 8 years, when girls just like that one, along with women and the elderly, were killed by thousands of mines in the Donbass. They were killed by the Ukrainian regime. Please visit the website of our ministry for more information, as I don't want to take up your time with long stories. If you are that concerned, as you are right to be, of the humanitarian consequence of any military operations, then God is willing for you to look at those pages which you have so far preferred not to touch on in your professional role.
Sergei Lavrov versus Kathy Newman. Well, the former chess world champion and human rights campaigner Gary Kasparov is a long-term opponent of Vladimir Putin. He joins me now from New York. Thank you very much for coming on the program, Mr. Kasparov. When you hear Vladimir Putin say today that everything is going to according to plan, when you hear Sergei Lavrov say to Kathy Newman that basically civilian casualties, well, that's all made up, it's all a pack of lies, What's your response?
Lying is the main trait of Putin's character, and now I saw Lavrov simply following the same lines as his boss, who is hiding in a bunker, by the way. I'm still shocked, because the amount of lies that Lavrov projected in a few minutes, it's remarkable. It's remarkable, and he hasn't blinked. We had so much evidence. It's videos of apartment blocks being ruined, and we know that they are targeting them. Putin failed to take over Ukraine in a few days, as he planned. And now his wrath is aimed at helpless Ukrainian civilians. We are facing now war crimes on an industrial scale. And Mr. Lavrov, as everybody else who is behind the war, is a war criminal. And I hope that he will keep his posture and calm when he will be interrogated in Hague.
Now, of course, the Western policy has been to exert pressure on Vladimir Putin by putting pressure on the oligarchs, his rich mates around him. Do you think that policy will work? Do you think Vladimir Putin cares about the economic fate of his friends?
It could have helped 8 years ago, maybe even 6 months ago, maybe even a month ago, though I doubt very much, probably 1 month ago was really too late. But the refusal to recognize threat coming from Vladimir Putin for years and years, despite warnings about his crimes and his preparations to commit further crimes, ended with a situation as now where no oligarchs can influence him. He is hiding in a bunker. I think he doesn't trust anybody, and he is afraid for his life, and he is not listening to anyone. So forget about Putin. We are no longer, talking to him, expecting him to act. Leave it for President Macron, who is doing it for whatever reason, maybe for political reasons, because he's campaigning now. But we need to send a very clear message to those who carry criminal orders. And also forget Lavrov. It's about Russian generals who are on the ground. And they have to recognize that they will be taking risk for their lives if they continue this criminal campaign.
But they may not recognize that. And I just wonder whether the current situation, the war actually strengthens Vladimir Putin's hand at home. He may impose martial law any time now. He's locking up demonstrators. He's shut down all the opposition television and radio stations. Does this make him stronger, or is he ultimately digging his own political grave?
I'm surprised to hear that imposing martial law is strengthening anybody's hand. Putin is losing. Russian economy is in tatters. Things are getting worse, and it's a matter of time if the sanctions are hauled, and if every loophole is closed, and if the free world keeps exerting this pressure on Russia economically, politically, and financially, and isolate Russia, I think in a few weeks' time we'll see not thousands or 10,000 people on the streets, but millions, because I don't think they're willing to pay ultimate price for Putin's war. But we need to see the political will in the free world, and I still hear doubts about very consistent campaign to overthrow Putin's regime, because this is a war, and the free world is already engaged in this war, and this war cannot end in a tie. It's either Putin succeeds in Ukraine and continues his campaign against NATO countries, or will use this war in Ukraine and Putin's army will be destroyed there and Russian economy will collapse and Putin regime will be overthrown. There is no third way.
Okay, finally and briefly, you're, of course, a world chess champion. I'm not sure if Vladimir Putin plays chess or if you've ever played him yourself, but do you think that he is thinking several moves ahead? Is he a tactician? Is he still rational, or is he losing his mind?
He has never played chess. Dictators do not play chess. Chess is the game that played by the rules, and you have 100% information about opponent's resources. Putin, as every dictator is, if you want to use any gaming metaphor, has been playing poker, and now he's playing nuclear poker. It's all about bluffing. He had weak cards, and he won many times because opposition, the free world, the leaders of the free world, folded their cards. Now he's raising stakes, but he's also bluffing. And it's time to actually call the bluff, because he will not stop. the failure to stop him in Ukraine will lead to the extension of his military campaign and crimes to NATO countries.
Okay. All right, got to leave it there. Gary Kasparov, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go to Jackie in London. Jackie.
Thanks, Matt. The French authorities have seized a yacht belonging to the wealthy Russian industrialist Igor Sechin. There has also been speculation that another massive yacht owned by billionaire industrialist Alisher Usmanov has been seized in the German port of Hamburg, with news just breaking that he has been added to sanctions list in the UK and the USA. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi reports.
Russian wealth. Just a few hundred people are estimated to have more than $500 billion in riches. But now those assets are in the sights of an unprecedented wave of Western sanctions. This is Alisher Usmanov's 512-foot mega yacht, the Dilbar. It's worth $600 million and has the biggest swimming pool ever installed on a yacht and houses 96 staff. But this morning, it looked like this. With feverish reports that the German authorities in Hamburg had seized it, the local ministry told us that the situation was deeply complicated, as its ownership structure was opaque and it has not yet been seized. In the UK, the government rushed out an announcement that Usmanov, a former prominent shareholder in Arsenal Football Club, was being added to the sanctions list here, along with Russia's former Deputy Prime Minister, Igor Shuvalov. Not to be outdone, the French seized the Amore Vero, true love no longer. It belongs to Igor Sechin, one of the most, if not the most powerful of Moscow's political elite. He runs the state oil company Rosneft, which BP recently promised to sell out of. It had been in harbour for a refit since January, and the French officials said it was trying to sail away urgently without completing the repairs. The Foreign Secretary today said Britain too was fast-tracking sanctions against oligarchs.
We've also been at the forefront in tightening the vice on the Kremlin through sanctions, and it's vital at this juncture that we keep our foot on the gas, and we're fast-forwarding sanctions against Russian oligarchs.
But there have been questions about this man, Roman Abramovich, Britain's most famous Russian, who has now pledged to sell out of Chelsea Football Club amid heated speculation he's about to be added to the sanctions list. His £160 million house in Kensington Palace Gardens, just behind William and Kate, has also been subject to sales gossip. But the UK government is yet to produce the full 100 or so Russian names for the sanction list that the Prime Minister promised. British lawyers have been blamed by politicians who have labelled them enablers for Russian money. But today, one lawyer hit back, saying the fault really lies with Downing Street and the decades of cuts to law enforcement.
I think a lot of nonsense is spoken about all the sort of rich lawyers representing rich clients against the poor people. I mean, if the government had effectively resourced white-collar crime, we wouldn't be having this conversation. This conversation doesn't happen in the United States. The test in relation to sanctioning people is a low test. It's a reasonable grounds to suspect that the person is an involved person. And involved means essentially that you're obtaining a benefit or providing an economic benefit to the Russian Federation. And there are a list of sectors in which you are involved, you can be sanctioned. And there are chemicals, transport, the finance industry, construction, energy, etc. So it catches an awful lot of the people about whom everyone is talking. So it's not a very high evidential threshold.
But those who have followed these money trails for years warned that Russian money has been entrenched in Britain for decades.
There is no quick fix to this situation. We have built a system for 30 years whereby these people have buried their wealth in the very fabric of our economy and society. Extracting that is not something you can just flick a switch and it happens. This requires stripping away layers of shell companies, going after multiple assets in multiple jurisdictions, hidden behind multiple different kinds of structures. It's going to be incredibly difficult.
Tonight's sanction edition means just 13 Russian individuals being added since the Ukrainian invasion. The government claims it's done more to tackle banks, airlines and listed companies, with a total of 220 entities, people and subsidiaries being hit. This conflict, however, is set to be protracted, and many think sanctions will have to intensify substantially for it to really damage Putin and his circle.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Well, joining me now from Washington is the British ambassador to the United States, Karen Pierce. Karen Pierce, thank you very much for coming on the programme. I don't know if you heard my interview with Gary Kasparov there, but he basically said that we were far too late in imposing sanctions on Russian billionaires who are close to Vladimir Putin. This should have happened months, if not years ago. What do you say to that?
Well, the West took a view that we would wait to impose big sanctions, restrictions on Russia, and we waited because we wanted it to be a deterrent. When it wasn't a deterrent, i.e. when Putin recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk republics as breakaways, then the British government brought in its sanctions, first on oligarchs and then on banks, and then the G7 followed. And as you've seen over the last week, there's been a progressive ratcheting up of sanctions and also broader scope.
But I wonder if it should have been done earlier, because, I mean, even today, sanctions were announced against Alisher Usmanov, who is one of Russia's richest billionaires. That should have been done months ago, surely, so that these people could have used an opportunity to say to their friend Vladimir Putin, don't try this, we're all suffering here economically. We just missed that window of opportunity.
I wouldn't put it like that. A lot of sanctions were introduced after 2014 and Putin's invasion of Crimea, and Britain was right in the forefront of that. Under the law, we have to follow the law. We have to have the evidence that enables us to bring in sanctions, and we have had to introduce from scratch sanctions legislation in the United Kingdom. We've done that, which is what's enabled us to take part in these G7 sanctions. And I would also point to the economic crime bill that the government is bringing forward to give it even more powers to sanction these sorts of individuals, their illicit financing, their property. So I think we're doing a huge amount, but as the Foreign Secretary said, nothing's off the table, and we're going to keep going.
What about oil and gas sanctions?
Well, I think we would all agree that Europe needs to reduce its dependency on Russian hydrocarbons. For the UK, there's a tiny amount of our fuel supplies that come from Russia. So this is not primarily a question for the UK, except insofar as sanctions do cause us difficulties on fuel price rises, and the government's looking at that. But yes, we need a transition away from dependency on Russian oil and gas, and the G7 and the EU and other Europeans and the US, we are all talking about that. We've released some strategic reserves of oil onto the market, as have the Americans, to help with the immediate problem.
Europe is acting, the EU is acting in quite an extraordinary way after lots of divisions about how to deal with Russia. Do you sometimes think, perhaps in the middle of the night, that we would be so much better off if we were still inside the European Union dealing with this particular issue?
I think you'll find that the US, the UK and the EU have been working incredibly closely together on this crisis. And on the military and security side, that list of allies also includes NATO, of course. So no, I don't accept the premise of your question. The United Kingdom made a decision. We have left the European Union. We're now working very closely with our EU and other partners on this crisis.